Welcome, Owen. You were born in Fiji and raised in Wales. Do you feel that your cultural background has had an influence on your writing?
Well, in terms of being born in Fiji, I mean, obviously that wasn't something that I was ever really aware of as I was growing up, because I was only about 2 years old when I came back. But the resonance of being born there, I think, actually ended up being very influential to me. In that, as I started to learn that I was born on the other side of the world, I certainly became fascinated to see this place and actually to get back there. And as soon as I could, I did. And I went back there when I was 18 years old. And in the Blue Book, I did end up writing a sequence of poems about going back to Fiji. So I suppose that event, the fact I was born there, ended up having quite a significant influence. But in terms of my writing voice, and in terms of, I suppose, my early reading, certainly, and therefore my early writing, then, I mean, Wales was obviously much more influential to me. But I think, possibly no more so than anyone's cultural background, or certainly any writer's cultural background, in that it's very natural that, where you're brought up and the landscape of where you're brought up really provides the bedrock of your writing. And I think perhaps more obviously when you start writing, but actually it continues to do so. So I know that in terms of, we all have our personal word hoards, these pools of vocabulary that we reach back into. And I know that for myself, that that pool of words is very much drawn from the landscape and the culture of South East Wales and the Black Mountains and where I'm from. And if anything, what I have to do now a lot as a writer is actually to push myself beyond that. And I think also in terms of, obviously all writers are readers first, or I certainly think that they should be readers first. It meant that, I guess, the writing that was really sort of resonating in me and that was sounding a very strong note in me early on was a writing that sounded a note against my cultural environment. So even though there might be someone like R.S. Thomas, who was actually a very different person, a very different writer, and actually writing about North Wales, there was something about the way that he approached the landscape, that incredibly visual poetry, his gift for metaphor, that ability to strike these two apparently disparate natural objects together, and then to create this third element, this stunning image. And the fact that his poems were peopled by I guess characters who were sparse of speech, and yet apparently sort of deep in significance and deep in symbolism. All of that, I think, worked upon me because of the area where I was brought up in, and sort of feeling those echoes between the two worlds.
It's interesting that you mention R.S. Thomas. I believe that you've described Wales as the coalface of poetry. Have you found the Welsh tradition for lyricism an inspiration or an expectation?
It's very interesting, the perceived traditions, I suppose, of Wales and poetry. Certainly we know that poetry has always had a very, very strong place in Welsh culture, specifically Welsh language culture, with forms such as the Englyn and Cynhanu being perhaps, probably some of the oldest unbroken forms that we have on these islands. At the same time, I suppose, I'm always very wary of being sort of rose-tinted about this, and, sort of having a good, honest look at this subject. I think there is a natural, or it feels as though there's a natural lyricism, even to, English spoken in Wales on the streets, in the valleys. But to be honest, if you asked a writer from Yorkshire or from Cumbria or from Scotland, you might find them saying the same. So perhaps it's just that we're especially attuned to our own sort of, the specifics of our own sort of local idiolects and our own dialects. That said, I was certainly brought up feeling very much that poetry occupied a more natural place in everyday life in Wales. So when I was a teenager and, I was playing for rugby clubs and I was becoming interested in writing, no one thought that was particularly strange. It was just sort of taken in people's strides. My grandfather was a maths teacher and a sheep farmer, but if the occasion arose, would turn his hand to writing in Englyn. So again, and certainly amongst his wider family, an association with literature and an ability really to express yourself in form and on the page was quite natural. Now I think that is actually quite unusual. I think it may have been more sensed than known in me. You asked about it being, I think, an expectation or
an inspiration.
An expectation or an inspiration. I mean, it's an inspiration in that the early Welsh poets that I was reading, people like Robert Mihinic, Danny Absey, Menna Elfyn, R.S. Thomas, were an inspiration, and obviously their poetry was drawn from a Welsh background. But I think also it's the expectation element that you have to be wary about, especially beyond Wales. There's a rather easy kind of broad brushstroke idea that, so Wales, a land of poetry and song and lyricism. Firstly, I think a lot of our best contemporary writers have moved in a very interesting way away from that lyricism. We've got, or certainly towards a much stronger note of lyrical realism, and there's some incredible gritty writing. Obviously Dylan Thomas casts a massive shadow over this, and there's a very unhelpful idea of sort of, for want of a better phrase, the verbose kind of, the Welsh windbag, or the Welsh poetry that sounds wonderful but doesn't mean much. Now, firstly, that's incredibly unfair to Thomas himself, because he was an incredibly well-read and a very erudite poet, and his poems always mean something and mean several things at once. But I think in the wider world, it's not always a very helpful expectation. It was interesting, I was based in New York for 2 years, and people go, a Welsh poet, for a start, everyone expects you to be drunk straight away. And you think, well, there are a lot more alcoholic English novelists. I don't know why you're expecting me to be especially, into my drink. And so, I think that what's unhelpful about it is that there's more a focus upon the poet than the poetry. And I think we have to ask this of ourselves in Wales as well. People say that Wales is, a land of poetry and song. You ask most people, which Welsh poets do you read, or do you even know? And you'll probably get Dylan Thomas, you'll probably get R.S. Thomas, you might get Danny Absey, and then it'll probably go pretty quiet. I guess maybe Gillian Clarke as well. But, compared to actually contemporary writing in Scotland and the place of poetry and literature in Scotland or in Ireland, I think we have to look a lot harder at the contemporary situation. We've got fantastic writers. If I'm honest, I don't think we've got a fantastic readership.
That's quite an interesting metaphor, Wales as the coalface of poetry. Does that suggest then that writing is more perspiration than inspiration?
I should say I've got no recollection of saying that Wales is the coalface of poetry. And I famously quite often disagree with what I've said in the past. I hope that's quite healthy. I think maybe what I meant to refer to is that for me, I think that Wales and poetry kind of together are what I see as the coalface of my work. But your question was about, to what extent is it perspiration, to what extent is it inspiration? Well, actually, to quote Dylan Thomas, he once said that art is an accident of craft. And I think that those two words, and actually a third, which is perhaps graft, are very intimately linked. I'm always very wary of the term inspiration. I sometimes feel that we need to find an alternative word, be it epiphany or whatever that word may be. But undoubtedly, poetry and also elements of novels and even non-fiction writing can rest upon a mysterious kind of intersection of ideas and rhythms and tones in the mind. And every now and then they will come together. And you will have that flash of not so much a complete poem or even a complete line, but you'll get a sense that there's something there. And again, almost a sense and a scent of something being there. And that is vital. And I think, that element of surprise in writing is also crucial. Robert Frost said famously, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. And so when I sit down to write, there's a certain amount that I like to know. If it's a poem, I want to know, or have a good idea of what is the motivation of this poem, what do I want to say, how do I perhaps want to say it, but there's a huge amount that I don't know. So it's not just about the inspiration of having the idea for a poem, but it's the inspiration in the moment of writing. But then the actual act of writing, be that with a pen or on a keyboard, nearly always draws something else forth, and quite often either what you're writing falls apart under your hands, and it's very strange sometimes if the first approach to the poem fails, sometimes that is it. You don't ever get it back, and that might sound strange, but you really don't. But if you get through that first draft, and I think that nearly always what you write does change, and sometimes can change very dramatically to what you set out to write, there is then the drafting process. And for me, especially poetry, where each word has such, so much a greater weight in the line, and is asked to do so much work, then drafting is vital. And drafting is really about, it's about writing as a writer, but then being able to edit as a reader. And it's about listening. It's about writing for the ear as well as for the eye, and being hard on yourself. And sometimes, it can be quite exhausting writing. I mean, it's not bricklaying, I know that. It's not, manual labour, but it can be mentally exhausting, and it can be very easy to not push yourself for that word or that phrase or that image that is actually more appropriate. So I think that there is quite a large amount of perspiration in writing, and that to a certain degree there should be. And even just talking with my friends who are writers and poets, I don't know anyone who has ever written down something and there's the finished poem. Absolutely. And of course, that element of drafting and craft, I always think that the fascinating flip side of that is then the studying of poetry. Because if anyone thinks that very careful, considered thought does not go into a poem, then they're wrong.
Leading on from that, Skewered Hill is paired with Seamus Heaney's new selected poems on the WJEC A-Level English Literature course. How do you feel being paired with a Nobel Prize-winning poet? And do you feel that there are any similarities in your work?
Well, in terms of being paired with the work of Seamus Heaney, that's obviously a fantastically flattering pairing for me. Although obviously that depends upon the nature of the pairing. I mean, it could be designed to say, look how good Seamus Heaney's work is, and this is what happens when it goes wrong. I'm thrilled actually on a much more personal level, in that it was some of the poems of Seamus Heaney that were literally, and I do actually mean that word literally, the first poems to give me goosebumps and to have the hairs on the back of my neck, rising up. So a poem like Midterm Break, which I think is very much still studied now, was one of those poems, that just illustrated to me how far you can take a reader across a short space of page, and how you can hit a reader, at the heart and the head simultaneously, and create a poem that has a long resonance of thought, but also a very real emotional impact, and so Seamus Heaney was vital to me, as I know he was to so many writers of my generation, in kind of showing the way. So in that respect, I was thrilled that my work was being paired with Seamus Heaney's. In terms of similarities, obviously I can't necessarily see them, but I'm perhaps not the person who's best placed to see them. There's a certain focus in subject matter upon rural life. We both, in very different ways, I guess, were brought up sort of either rubbing shoulders or in very close contact with working rural life, and I think that is evident in quite a few of the poems. There's always an anxiety of influence. I said that Seamus Heaney was very influential to so many poets of my generation, and he was, and sometimes in ways that we don't always know. So there may be, I think, and of course it's a very long line of inheritance, because I was going to say there may be something in finding those rhythms of speech in a poem, trying to locate the rhythms of certain parts of Wales into a poem in the same way that Seamus Heaney might have done in Ireland. But yet, if you listen to Seamus Heaney, he'll say that he was inheriting that from Edward Thomas and from Robert Frost, so it's all part of an ongoing chain of influence. But beyond that, I think I couldn't say if there is a similarity. That's for other people to see.
Indeed.
Or not.
Obviously, your novel Resistance features on the WJEC GCSE English Literature set text list. How does it feel to have your work studied and analysed rather than just merely read?
It's a very, very different experience. The experience of being studied as opposed to being read. And to be honest, it's one that I'm still sort of negotiating my experience to, because this is sort of relatively recent. I'm glad to say that the vast majority of that studying goes on without me being aware of it, without me knowing about it, and that's probably how it should be. Again, I actually feel very privileged, to have some work that I've written being studied, only because I know that the first writers I met when I was 14, 15, 16 years old had a very significant influence on me, and I think it's quite a responsibility. If your work happens to be some of the first work that students are meeting, my first anxiety is quite simply, is it good enough? And I want it to resonate with them, I want it to speak to them, and I just hope it does. In terms of a closer contact, because obviously now students are able to get in touch with living writers on the syllabus, be it through a website or Twitter or on Facebook. Certainly at readings, I go and do events in schools. And that's great. I love having very honest discussions about the work, and I love also saying sometimes, wouldn't necessarily trust the poet, I trust the poem, because I think that it's a very true and very valid thing to say. But there is a line that you can't cross, I want every reader to have their own experience with the work, and I don't want them either to expect or to have me sort of to tell them about it. In many ways, you write poems, you write novels, because they are the best ways in an imaginative medium that you have found of saying a certain thing, or of trying to pin an almost sort of ephemeral or ethereal sense or tone onto the page. And so it might sound like a slightly sly answer, but in a way, the work is nearly always the best answer I have. But I'm very up for engaging in the conversation with students.
I'm sure they'll be relieved to hear that. The depiction of the reality of hill farming in Resistance has drawn some parallels with Bruce Chatwin's On the Black Hill. Are you aware of any literary influences when you're writing?
When you're actually in the act of writing, I think it's very important not to be aware of any literary influences, and I never have been, certainly not consciously. I think if you're writing in a certain territory, be that geographical territory or in terms of subject matter, then it's important to know what has been written before, and it can be very helpful. So obviously when I was setting Resistance in the Black Mountains, I went back, both to Bruce Chatwin but also to Raymond Williams, who went to our school, of course, King Henry. And I went back to his People of the Black Mountains, and it was helpful. I'm just trying to think, actually, was it helpful? Because funny enough, I studied on the Black Hill for my A-level English. And I can remember thinking quite strongly, actually, that I admired Chapman's writing, but it felt like the writing of a tourist. It felt like the writing of someone who had certainly done all he could to engage with that landscape and with the people, but who was still viewing it as an outsider. Now maybe that was me being a slightly bolshy teenager, I don't know. But when I went back to the Black Hill, I must admit I wanted to try and push the writing and the book sort of deeper into the landscape and into the experience than perhaps he did. I'm not saying I was successful, but that was an aspiration. So yes, I was aware of those books, but in the writing, I think not only does every writer have to find their own voice. This might sound quite strange, but I think every book has to find its own voice. I'm working on a novel at the moment, and I've thrown away a good 40,000 words of it because I think sometimes you write until you hear something authentic, or until you hear an authentic voice, and I think I've heard that now. And that was the same with Resistance. What I will say, that if there was an influence upon Resistance, it was very genuinely from that landscape. And I hope that voice was inherited from that landscape. The lyricism of the style in a similar fashion. It might sound a bit much, but it's true, but there were several times when I was blocked and when I was stuck with the book, and I just simply went back to the Olchan Valley. Now perhaps I was unlocked just because I finally got a day to walk around on my own, but I think it was also because I was there as well, and it was almost like, it sort of felt as if I was taking dictation from from the landscape. I would see something, or there'd be a change in the weather, and it would send me down a certain pathway of thought, and that would end up being the next section of the novel.
Talking about resistance, how involved were you in translating the novel into the film version?
I'm very pleased that you used the term translation, because I must admit, I very much think of film adaptations from novels as being a form of translation, because you are translating them into a completely different medium, really into a different kind of literary language. I was pretty involved in that. I took the director back to the Olchan Valley. I was absolutely adamant that the film should be filmed in the landscape where the book is set. And I ended up co-writing the screenplay with the director as well. And as we went through the drafts, to be honest, he became increasingly the director and I became increasingly the writer. And that was fascinating for me. The first time that I'd written a screenplay. And I really enjoyed it. And I think I was able to enjoy it because from very early on, I was aware that no one was doing anything to the book. The novel is safe. It's on the shelf. And so personally, I saw it as a license to re-enter this territory of the story, to re-enter and to engage again with these characters in a new way, and to kind of play around with it, to do some things better. I think there's some elements of the story in the film that I prefer. But that was very much where my influence ended, and that was where my contribution ended as well, and I think that was quite right. So in terms of the finished film, I mean, there's an old adage which is, there's the film that you write, the film that they film, and the film that they edit. I'd say probably only a half to maybe 2/3 of the written script is in the finished film, and all sorts of things have a pressure on that. Certain filming days not going well, a budget in the edit. So the end result has been very interesting because I certainly feel a connection to it, and I feel a connection through that screenplay. But when I saw the film, it also genuinely felt like someone else's work. It felt like a very, very distant cousin of the book. And it felt like a very bold adaptation that was strangely faithful to the tone. And personally, that's what I want from a film adaptation, really. I want a film adaptation to do something else with the story. I don't just want this this visual tautology on the screen. So my involvement was first very much as a scriptwriter, but then since then as a viewer.
And has it altered your view of your characters in any way?
It has altered the view of my characters firstly, the most fundamental way is that when actors act in the film, they inhabit a character. And it's very strange because it's a very aggressive occupation of that character because it's suddenly visual. And I had visual images of Sarah and Albert in my head. Now, when I give readings, when I talk about the book, I see Andrea Riseborough and Tom Brashear, and weirdly enough, Tom Brashear also lives around the corner from here, so I also quite often see my character for a coffee or I catch the tube with him, which is a bit weird. But the other way that it really fundamentally changed my perception of the characters and actually of the story is that I found there was something quite protean about the film. Every time I watched it, it changed. And for me, it became increasingly Albrecht's story. And it was something that I hadn't been aware of before. I mean, it's there in the book, it's inlaid in the book. But it was almost as if I needed the film to show this to me, which was quite simply, when he arrives in that valley, he sees his duty change and he wants to save the people in the valley, both the German soldiers and the women. He wants to save everyone. But his tragedy, of course, is the minute he sets foot in that valley, he has already destroyed it. Because he is the war, and he can't leave the war. And for some reason, the film really sort of brought that front and centre for me.
You've recently won the 2012 Amnesty International Freedom of Expression Award for The Two Worlds of Charlie F. What did that mean to you as a writer?
The award meant a huge amount. It really did. I actually still get goosebumps thinking about it. And not just because it was a recognition for a very, very risky project where so many people had put so much on the line, much more than in a normal theatrical project, because this was a play that wasn't just inspired by the experiences of recently wounded service personnel and their families, but 15 of those service personnel were in the cast, so they actually made up the majority of the cast. And to do that, to ask them, because it wasn't a piece of verbatim theatre, it was very much drawn on their experiences, but this was a written piece of theatre, and in some ways I think therefore harder, because we were asking them to re-enter some very, very raw areas of their lives that happened very recently. Some of them had been wounded as recently as 5 or 6 months earlier, and to perform that on a stage in front of thousands of people. And they did it. Well, they didn't just do it, they just did it fantastic. They did it amazing. They had 18 straight standing ovations. I've never seen audiences respond to a piece of theatre. And that wasn't because of my writing, it was because of this extraordinary project. So the award meant a huge amount because it was a very risky project. We didn't know it was going to work. You know, I had to write the script in effectively sort of 2.5 weeks over Christmas. We then had 3 weeks to rehearse before the first performance. It was seat of the pants stuff. But also it meant so much, not just as a rehabilitation project to the guys, but I think also because for the play's message, you know, and I hope it's a message that sort of transcends the specific setting of Afghanistan and Iraq, a message, you know, about wounding in conflict, told by those who have been wounded in conflict. And so for me, that was I hope, a very powerful piece of anti-war theatre. Now, not everyone who took part in the production saw it as a piece of anti-war theatre, and that's fine. And because we were working alongside the MOD and the Royal British Legion, the play had quite a strong sort of military association, as it should in many ways. But as it developed, I also felt, and we all saw it, that it was speaking increasingly to people who didn't have an association with the military, weren't from a military family, but desperately wanted to know and wanted to hear from the horse's mouth. And I feel that's what the Amnesty Award has really done. It sort of shifted the play into the other territory, so it now lives, hopefully it sort of bridges across those two audiences. Has war been a theme that's developed consciously or subconsciously in your work? It's a very interesting question, and I'm pleased that you mentioned the idea that it may have developed subconsciously, because it certainly felt quite organic how war has entered my work. I mean, I can retrospectively, I can see the chain of influence, but it was never something that I set out to do. You know, you could argue that the chain sort of began with Andrew Motion telling me to go away and to read Keith Douglas, a fantastic Second World War poet. I was then performing in a play as Wilfred Owen. I became very interested as to why we study and we know the First World War poets, but we don't know the poets and the writers of the Second World War. So I wrote a play about Keith Douglas. I then wrote a play about Alan Lewis, fantastic Welsh poet and short story writer. And then, for whatever reason, these projects I think probably sort of left their resonance, and I found myself writing Resistance and then the 2 Wars of Charlie F, and I didn't go into any of these projects intending to write, you know, my next project will be about war. But what they all do have in common, and I think it's very important to say, is that in some way I wanted to write them because of contemporary conflicts. And the fact is that we've been engaged in some kind of conflicts now for the last 12 years, which is more or less exactly how long I've been a professional writer. And it might sound overly simplistic, but as long as we keep doing this ridiculous thing called war, then I'll probably continue writing about it, because however old the stories about war are, we're obviously not listening to them.
True. You mentioned Andrew Motion there, and he, I believe, has praised your writing as being sharp, clear and ambitious from a young age. Did you feel the weight of that kind of praise and that expectation on you as a young writer?
When I was a young writer, I sometimes still consider myself a young writer. No, fair enough. I don't think I was ever aware of it really. I mean, I felt very lucky when someone like Andrew Motion sort of notices your work and says something as kind as that. I did feel very lucky. But I think the other thing I've done is that I've tended to switch, between genres and between media even, so I followed up the Blue Book with a prose book, The Dust Diaries, and then some more poetry with Skirret Hill, and then my first novel. And I think I've partly done that because I happen to find that more interesting as a writer. I actually find writing most interesting when you're quite far down the learning curve. that's when it really excites me. It's when you're learning about different engines of storytelling and you're saying, okay, well, how does this work in film? How does this work in fiction? But I think it means that I've also sort of managed to dodge any expectation. There hasn't felt that, oh God, someone's like my first book of poetry. What am I going to write for my second? Because actually I was immersed in the Dust Diaries, which was such a different project, such a different endeavour that it felt like I was doing my first thing all over again. But I think as you put more work out there in the world, and as you're lucky enough to get a readership of some kind, you can be aware of what those readers may think of something, especially if it's very different. But I think you have to put that to one side. You have to, and you can go through some pretty tortuous routes here. I mean, the worst thing you can do is to try to write to please other people. If you do that, you just write bad stuff. So you have to be very true to whatever the story is that you're wanting to tell, be that non-fiction or fiction. It's going to sound like an awful cliche, but you have to be true to yourself. But quite often, the hardest parts of yourself, the stuff that you don't really perhaps want to acknowledge, and may even be very deeply buried in a work of fiction or a work of poetry that perhaps no one else will even recognise as being part of you. But I think that's the route to explore. That's the seam to be excavated, and various other metaphors stretched to breaking point. So far at least, I haven't felt that expectation. I mean, I think you can feel it within individual works. We were just talking about the Two Worlds of Charlie F. I felt a massive duty of care to the people involved in that project, because they'd been incredibly generous with their memories and with their experiences, and I just wanted whatever we created to feel true and to feel authentic for them.
Because you mentioned there a couple of nuggets of advice for perhaps aspiring young writers. Is there anything further that you could suggest for any young people who may be interested in following a career as a writer?
Yes, firstly, probably best not to think about it as a career. I never have. For several reasons. Firstly, it's probably not going to earn you a huge amount of money, but if you do become a writer, it will be worth so much more in other ways, and I'm very genuine about that, and I feel very lucky that's the case. In terms of being in charge of your own time, in charge of your own thoughts, being able to explore what interests you in the world is a rare, rare privilege. The main advice, though, would be to read. I don't know a single good writer who isn't a reader. So read and read and read, and read with the eye of a writer. So read critically. Ask a lot of the writers who you read. Beyond that, it might sound obvious, but be as interesting as possible, but more importantly, be interested. There are stories right under your nose. There are stories, in the house next door to you, in your school. It's all around you. It's about sort of breaking through that everyday shell of kind of our everyday seeing and starting to see the world in a slightly different way. So be interesting and be interested, and don't get too full of yourself. Whether you're finding your stories in the lives of other people or not, you need to be interested in other people, and to be interested in the right way, you need to be open to them. You need to be a very good listener, and you need to be able to move in all walks of life. I think that's quite a lot of advice, but I guess to boil it down, it's to read, to be hard on the writers you read, but also to be tough on yourself. And be original as you can be.
Do you feel that your own studies at school and then later at university helped prepare you for your vocation as a writer?
I'm not sure how much they helped to prepare me. I think my English studies in school were certainly vital to me becoming a writer, simply because I was reading stuff that I thought was fantastic. That could have been Antony and Cleopatra, or R.S. Thomas, or Seamus Heaney. So they were vital, and they were vital to sort of start me understanding, that writing is a craft, and that there is something very genuinely there to be studied and to be learned and to be appreciated. I enjoyed studying English at university hugely, but it was like kind of a stunning hammer blow in that I didn't write really when I was in university. And I think it was because I was just simply reading so much and absorbing so much literature that I couldn't hear my own voice at all. And I think undoubtedly all of that was undoubtedly helpful, just in terms of the breadth of reading. That said, I would hope I would have done a lot of that reading anyway. I would certainly miss some of that teaching, but I do sometimes wish that I'd done something else very different at university, be it history or anthropology or philosophy. So I think certainly my school English studies had a bearing upon what I did next. And then I should say that after studying English, I then did an MA in creative writing, which I was pretty sceptical about. But Andrew Motion was my tutor, which is probably why he said those nice words. But he very wisely, I think, said to me, he said, well, if an artist can go to art school, if an actor can go to drama college, then why shouldn't a writer spend a year having what they think they want to do at the centre of their lives? And I learnt a lot in that year, mainly through reading from this different angle of entry. And I talked about it before, but reading as a writer. And so really looking at how a poet or how a novelist pulls something off.
Because it's interesting you highlight the value of reading there. Do you have any suggestions for good reads that a writer such as yourself could recommend?
I think it's certainly important to read what is being written now, what's being published now. So if you're interested in writing poetry or novels, read the young writers who are bringing out their first books and their first books of poems now. In terms of poetry, Ted Hughes famously said that Edward Thomas is the father of us all. I would certainly read Edward Thomas, Seamus Heaney, R.S. Thomas, Elizabeth Bishop, fantastic American poet. The list goes on and on. And I think quite often when I'm asked this question, you can only go to sort of quite recent writing that is really turning you on. Recently, a fantastic American novelist called James Salter. I guess I'm keen to mention him because a lot of other people I could mention, you'll hear mentioned elsewhere, and they will probably cross your path. You could go through life and the work of James Salter might not cross your path. And if you're interested in writing fiction especially, that would be a great shame, because he's a wonderful writer, amazing writer.
You've achieved a huge amount in your career to date as a young writer. What ambitions do you have for the future?
Ambitions for the future in terms of writing, obviously. I'd like to write a really good poem. Just one.
Do you not feel like you've done that already?
No, not entirely. No. Not what I'd call really a true poem. But I think that those should be elusive. And they should be hard. And you should keep reaching for them. And I've always said that if you get to the end of your writing life, and it can be considered that you've written 2 or 3 really true, really good poems. I reckon that's a pretty good hit rate. But in the near future, I would like to actually write more poetry. I feel as though I haven't given poetry nearly the room or the space that I would like to, and that's something that I would like to do. The 2 Worlds of Charlie F has got me fascinated in theatre, and I'm interested in writing more for the theatre as well. And I suppose the major ambition is to try and to find time for the writing that I feel matters. And that isn't always easy, not if you live as a writer. Sometimes it can be a case of you write one for yourself and one for them. And I'd like to be able to take more time over my writing. 2012 has been a year of writing quickly. Charlie F was written in about 2.5 weeks. A long poem for Radio 4 called Pink Mist was written in about 2 weeks. I've just written a book about the Welsh rugby team, which was actually written in about 2 months. Now these are not badges of honour So this is actually a word of caution to any young writers out there. This is not how you should be writing. But for whatever reason, I sort of found myself in those situations. And what is interesting is that I think that there can be benefits from sort of hot housing work, and that's been very interesting for me to experience. But going forward, I'd like to make proper time for the writing that matters.
Owen, thank you very much for your time and allowing us to put these questions to you and giving some insight both into your work and to yourself as a writer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.